Psychoanalysis and Indian tradition. We continue our series. We did a few sessions on Yoga Sutras, then Brahma Sutras, and now we will do a session on Upanishads. So today we'll take a concise look at the Upanishads. Upanishads are a very important part of Hindu spiritual literature, one of the foundations of Hindu spirituality. There are about 108 Upanishads, of which 11 are major Upanishads, referred to as Mukhya Upanishads. Each Upanishad is a book into itself, which needs a few sessions to go into. In our limited time, we cannot go into each of the 11 Upanishads, leave alone 108 Upanishads. So unlike in case of Yoga Sutra, we won't go here line by line. Unlike in case of Brahma Sutra, we won't be able to go even chapter by chapter or Upanishad by Upanishad. In our limited time today, we will take an overall concise look on all Upanishads, especially the 11 major Upanishads, and see from psychoanalytic standpoint what is there in terms of compare, contrast, synthesis. So let us go into the Upanishads. Vedas are very important, in fact some say most important part of Hinduism. And Vedas are four, which we all know: Rig Veda, Samveda, Yajurveda, Atharva Veda. If we look into Vedas, one way to classify the content of the Vedas is to classify them into three parts. That part which deals with rituals and ceremonies of all kinds of rituals and ceremonies, not necessarily spiritual or religious. And then one part which deals with worship or those special ceremonies towards some spiritual or religious goal. And then one part deals with pure spiritual knowledge. And if we divide the content of Veda in this way, the last part which deals with the knowledge component, and this knowledge refers to spiritual knowledge. This is not the knowledge of physics or chemistry or geology. This is a spiritual knowledge, often synthetically going together with a philosophy. So this is a philosophico-spiritual knowledge, or rather I would say spirito-philosophical knowledge, a better description. And this component of the Veda is referred to as Vedanta or Upanishads. So Upanishads essentially flow out of the Vedas. the knowledge component of the Vedas. They are therefore also called as Vedanta, which is the end of Veda, figuratively also termed as the heights or the peak of Vedas in terms of knowledge. To which there is a very important qualification. Some of the parts of Vedas which are not covered in Upanishads often have a very deep import, a very deep insight into reality or into mystical powers or mystical processes, which have not been understood fully in recent times. So with that qualification, we can say Upanishads are among the most valuable parts of the Vedas. In total, there are 108 Upanishads. Some people also give a figure of 115. I have also read a figure of 210. But most books settle at the number of 108. So I have put 108 here. And out of 108, 11 Upanishads are termed as the major Upanishads. And there is an opinion that other Upanishads actually are a mix and match and add something to the mix and match of the 11 major Upanishads. We will leave that question aside for a moment, if it is true or not. So we won't go into the question of if apart from the major Upanishads, the other Upanishads are derivatives of the major Upanishads with a little add and subtract, or are they independent Upanishads? We'll not go into the question today. It's a separate question. And that will take us into the contents of the 108 Upanishads, for which we don't have time today. So we have 11 major Upanishads. And these 11 major Upanishads are supposed to be carriers of distillation of knowledge of the Veda, created by various rishis at various times. So it is not, these 11 major Upanishads are not creation of one person. They are creation of many rishis. In some cases, we know who is the rishi. In some cases, we don't. Upanishads, especially the 11 major Upanishads, are very important also from another point of view. In Hindu tradition, spiritual literature is very vast. And there are books and books and books. However, a few books are respected more than others, and they are termed as the seminal books. And if you collect those cardinal books of Hindu spirituality, then we come across a very special word called Prasthantrayi. Prasthantrayi means Trayi is three books, and Prasthan means to take leave, say goodbye, to move out of some place. What this means is that these three books, Upanishads, Brahma Sutras, and the Gita, the three constitute the Prasthantrayi, the most important of books. Not that everyone would agree. This is one opinion. There are many other opinions also. Particularly if you look at, why look anywhere? If you ask me, I would substitute Brahma Sutra by Yoga Sutra. And I would also include a book by Shiva, where he gives, I'm forgetting the name. It will come. Where he gives 108 different techniques for spiritual evolution. A very famous book. I'm not sure why it's not occurring to me, that name. It will come. I would include that book also. And I would also include some book on Hatha Yoga and many books from Tantra and Agora in this top list. But my opinions aside, tradition talks about Prasthantrayi, 3 important books, which if you read, you can move out of the circle of birth and death. You can go into nirvana, moksha, mukti. You can do a prasthan from this world by reading these 3 books. So these 3 books help you to move out of the compulsive involvement in this world. And therefore these 3 books are called Prasthantrayi. And therefore we see the significance of Upanishad. That Upanishads, 11 especially, the major Upanishads, they are a part of this chosen select 3. That tells us the significance of Upanishads. Now let us go into the 11 Upanishads and also take a look at from which Veda this Upanishad flows or where it is found. And what is something very important in that Upanishad, something which is very deep or something which is very popular by which that Upanishad has come to be known. So let us look at the 11 most respected Upanishads. On the left hand side on the screen you can see Isha Upanishad, coming out of Yajurveda, and one of the core concepts it elaborates on in detail is oneness in existence. One Brahma becoming everything and yet not exhausting itself. One becomes many, but nothing is subtracted from the one. So this is the theme very strongly taken up. There are other themes also. Upanishads don't deal only with one statement or one theme, but I have taken here something which is very interesting, very deep, or very popular. Second Upanishad is Kena Upanishad, flowing from Samveda, deeply deliberating upon knowledge of different types and realization. What is the difference between an ordinary knowledge and spiritual knowledge which leads to realization? In Upanishads, we talk about aparavidya and paravidya. Aparavidya are empirical sciences, and paravidya is the knowledge of the beyond, the spiritual knowledge which is not empirical in nature. So the difference between knowledge, ordinary knowledge, and spiritual knowledge, or spiritual knowledge, is centered around realization. Realization of certain rare states of consciousness. In fact, it's not only some rare states of consciousness. Some people even have a realization so deep that there are fundamental changes even in the biology. But in most cases, the realization primarily takes place in the consciousness. Third is Katha Upanishad, coming out of Yajurveda. talks about how the spiritual path is like walking on the spiritual path is like moving on the razor's edge. Anytime you can fall, anytime you can get cut. And there is a very important story of Nachiketa in this Upanishad, where Nachiketa is a small boy who has a dialogue with the god of death, and the god of death gives him 3 boons, and he asks for 3 questions, answers to 3 questions. We don't have time, but just to mention those questions in brief, he talks about what is death, what happens after death, how to get into immortality, and how will he get back to planet Earth from where he has reached into the Yamaloka, or the kingdom of death. Then we have the Prashna Upanishad coming out of Atharvaveda, deeply delving upon the question of life. What is the purpose of life? What is life? Why should it flow only in a particular way? Mundaka Upanishad, again coming out of Atharvaveda, again going deep into the higher knowledge and lower knowledge, spiritual and the empirical, ordinary and the non-ordinary, rare and that which can be easily tested. Mandukya coming out of Atharvaveda, deeply delving onto the states of consciousness. It goes into the waking state, the sleeping state, the dream state, and a state beyond all the 3, the Turiya state. Taittiriya Upanishad coming out of Yajurveda talks about how initially we should start with obeying certain ethical laws and then proceed to spiritual wisdom, very much on lines of Yoga Sutras, Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga, very much on those lines, that we must have an ethical base before going into deep spirituality. Then we have Taittiriya Upanishad coming out of Rig Veda, deeply talking about Atma, rebirth, the journey of Atma. Chandogya Upanishad coming out of Samveda. Very popular sentence from it is Tattvamasi, thou art that. The idea is to see everyone as a manifestation of Brahman. And there is a very famous story of Shwetaketu. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad the Brihadaranyaka, the twister, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad comes out of Yajurveda, talks about how salt dissolves in water. Similarly, the individual self dissolves into Brahma. Very popular analogy it discusses. Essentially, it's one of the, not one of the, I think it's the longest Upanishad, the Brihadaranyaka, and written by Yajnavalkya, and it deals with this whole question of individual self and the collective universal self. Shwetaswatra, coming out of Yajurveda, and talks about self-discipline for realization, very much on lines of Taittiriya and Yoga Sutras. This is the list of 11. Some people have a slightly separate list of 11. I have seen certain lists of Mukhya Upanishads where instead of Shwetaswatra, some other Upanishad was put in, I think Kaustaka or something, some other Upanishad was put in there. but this is the most common list. Now, what are the subjects primarily these Upanishads, all 11 of them deal with? They deal with many subjects. From our point of view, what is of interest is this: the central concerns of these 11 Upanishads. First, Atma or the soul. The soul. Brahma or the soul and the ground of the universe. The omnipotent force, power, consciousness from which universe proceeds, who controls the universe, and to whom universe returns at the end. Questions of what is life, what is death, what happens after death, why do events happen in the world as they happen, what is the meaning of history, and what is this individual search, which is a spiritual search. Why can't an individual rest content with ordinary life? Why this search? What are the different states of consciousness ordinarily? And what are the rare states of consciousness? Those goal situations, the goal positions, the goal attainments, which we call as enlightenment. Subjects of happiness, pain, and ananda. Happiness and pain, we know. Different types of happiness and different types of pain, we all know. Ananda is bliss. The pleasure and the pain are cause dependent. Ananda is independent of cause, and its feeling is very different. The feeling of bliss is far more satisfying and comforting and likable compared to ordinary pleasures. So how do we move out of this strange hold of addiction to pleasure and therefore suffering of pain, this package offer of happiness and pain? How do we get rid of this package offer and go into a state of causeless ananda, causeless bliss? That is a subject matter also of discussion. Then there is a subject of enlightenment. What is it? What is the state of enlightenment like? If this is the goal state, what is the goal like? And is it one goal, or can you experience it differently? Then the path to enlightenment, how to reach there. From where we are, if we want to reach the state of enlightenment, so that we can be free from the package offer of pleasure and pain and be in a state of ananda, what is the path to that enlightenment? And an enlightened person, how does he live? So what is it post-enlightenment? These are some of the topics which get discussed along with other topics, but these are the central topics of our interest. Let us look at a few great statements, very popular statements from each of the Upanishads. Satyameva Jayate, truth alone triumphs. It's from Mundaka Upanishad. We all hear these statements, but we don't realize they are coming from Upanishads. So I have put together 10-11 statements, so we realize how deeply contents of the Upanishad are floating around in our everyday culture, especially Hindu culture. Aham Brahmasmi, or I am Brahma, the divine. It comes from Brihad Aranyakya Upanishad. Ekam eva dvitiyam Brahma. Eva is, there is no other. Only this. There is only one and there is no other than the Brahman. Eva is no other. So the only thing in existence is Brahma, there is nobody else. All the manifestations we see are manifestations of one Brahma. Comes from Chandogya. The whole universe is Brahma, the divine. It's only Brahma and nothing else. Same thing coming again in Chandogya in a different way. Same meaning, different statement. Matru Devo Bhava, Pitru Devo Bhava, Acharya Devo Bhava, Atithi Devo Bhava. Atithi Devo, the first three, Matru Devo Bhava, Pitru Devo Bhava, often is recited as a prayer in schools. Acharya Devo Bhava is often used on Teachers' Day. Atithi Devo Bhava is used by Tourism Ministry, Government of India. And all of this is coming from Taittiriya Upanishad. It says, mother, father, teacher, and the guest are as venerable as gods. 5 more popular statements which are used every day in India, but few people know they come from Upanishads. Very popular. Asato ma sadgamaya, tamso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma amritam gamaya. Comes from Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. From falsehood lead me to truth, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. 7. The wise man beholds all beings in the self and the self in all beings. For that reason, he does not hate anyone. Coming from Isha Upanishad. Just as a spider spins forth its thread and draws back again, the whole creation is woven out from Brahma, and to it again it returns back. It explodes out of Brahma and collapses back into Brahma. Mundaka Upanishad. As the same fire assumes different shapes when it consumes objects differing in shape, so does oneself take the shape of every creature in whom he is present. Brahma appearing in various manifestations. Katha Upanishad. There is no joy in the finite, there is joy only in the infinite. Chandogya. One's own thought is one's world. What a person thinks is what he becomes. Maitri Upanishad. So these are some of the popular statements, very widely used in India, very widely used in Hindu culture, without realizing the source of these statements being the Upanishads. Tells us how deeply Upanishads are woven in our everyday Hindu culture. On the whole, what is the context and the flavor of the Upanishads? Upanishads are not research journals. These are not research papers. These are not books written by an intellectual or a researcher. These are collection of mystical statements, mystical discussions between a guru and an aspirant or a student. These are statements of mystics. These are not paragraphs written by a researcher. These are, some of them are very poetic. These are, many of them are conversations between a student and an aspirant, a student and a guru. I mean, on one end you have the guru, on the other end you have the student or aspirant or disciple. The conversation is happening in the context of spirituality and in a situation where the speaker and the listener both are trained in Hindu culture as well as Hindu spirituality, and it is not something between a teacher and an untrained student. So often the context is presumed to be there with the student. The fundamentals of spirituality are presumed to be there with the student. So the guru is not talking to a novice. The guru is generally talking to somebody who is already steeped in Hindu culture, who already knows about the fundamentals of Hindu spirituality. The listener or the questioner is a spiritual aspirant. He is not an intellectual or a researcher. What the guru says to the listener or the questioner is subject contextual, aspirant contextual, very important. If the same question was to be raised by somebody else, not necessarily he would get the same answer. So in different Upanishads, the same question may have been asked by different people to different gurus, and they may have answered it differently. At times, essence is the same, expression is different. At times, the guru shows a completely new path towards the same goal, addressing the same question. Upanishads are not very rigorously, systematically structured like Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. These are more works of mystical poets rather than somebody who is very rigorous in prose and structure. You can compare Patanjali's Yoga Sutras with Upanishads and we can see the difference in flavor. Upanishads more resemble mystical poetic treatment of a subject rather than a structured, logical, empirical, prose treatment of a subject. In the Western context, we can think about Virgil's poem, Flight from Alone to the Alone. This is very much the flavor in which the poetry of Upanishad flows. Rather happens. The Upanishads also have a mantric quality to them, and often they have hidden meanings that reveal to somebody and not to everybody. So this is the broad context and flavor of the Upanishads, and in this context, we have to approach the Upanishad. What does it tell us from a psychoanalytic standpoint if we do a study, compare, contrast, synthesis? A study of Upanishad tells us that the model of the mind Upanishads have in consideration is very different from the model of the mind we use in psychoanalysis. If we keep on the one hand model of the mind of Freud and Jung, and on the other the yogic model of the mind, the Tantra model of the mind, and Sri Aurobindo's model of the mind, which are closer to the mind model of the mind that Upanishad presupposes, we can see the difference. The model of the mind presupposed in Upanishad is very different from the model of the mind that is used in psychoanalysis. So one area of possible synthesis is this. Second, psychoanalysis stops at the constitution. We don't get into why the constitution is what it is. Upanishads take a step back and put out two things. One is karma and second is self-journey. That the constitution is not an accident. The constitution is shaped by the journey of the soul and the karma it brings. And the two put together constitute our subjectivity. And this brings in this whole element of reincarnation. It also brings in the element of karma. And a very important question, does karma affect creation of pathology and healing of pathology? Can somebody be destined to enter into a pathology? The same experience happens to two people. Both children don't develop a trauma. One gets over it and one can't get over it for a lifetime. So is it just a coincidence? Is it just an accident? Or is there a principle at work? Upanishads say there is a principle at work. In psychoanalysis, the scientific position is we don't know. Upanishad goes in a different direction. It says that the karma and the self journey can predispose somebody to pathology, and until these two allow the healing of pathology, the healing won't take place. That does not mean therapy has no power, no meaning. But what it means is that in therapy, even as the healing happens, and we often realize the same statement doesn't work in the 55th session, but works in the 65th session. And one way to explain it, not the only way to explain it, is to say that in some situations of this type, not all situations of this type, it may happen that only when the karma was exhausted, the healing could take place and the interpretation or something else could take place. So essentially, if we draw a force field of factors of health and factors of sickness, on the side of factor of health, we have to put in two more forces of self-journey and karma. And essentially, it becomes again a force field. From there is no escape. That essentially every situation, every event is in a force field. Upanishad talks about rare states of mind which are neither accepted nor appreciated by psychoanalysis. Long way to go. States of mind that Patanjali refers to as samadhi. Various states of mind, different types of samadhi. And these rare states of mind are very healing, very pleasing, fulfillment giving. And these are the goal states. So what is goal in Upanishad is not even accepted as possible or important in psychoanalysis. Complete divergence on this point. On the point of the state of enlightenment, which is a rare state of the mind, and which is a goal state according to Upanishad. The realization of Brahma, or realization of state of no thought, or realization of Kaivalya, or realization of Nirvana, or realization of oneness with existence. Patanjali goes a step further. He even says experience of stillness, experience of, he even says equanimity, which I don't agree, but he does say equanimity. And experience of psychic being, or even experience of oneness with matter in inertia. These are all rare states of mind, but these are goal states in spirituality and Upanishads, of course. Upanishads also have a different take on the laws of nature, that the laws of nature themselves are in evolution and they are purposive. They are not purpose agnostic. And there is a law of karma also at work. And this is one of the most fundamental laws in reality, the law of karma. And this goes at various levels. At the individual level, it is the law of individual karma. Collective level, collective karma. And then at a level of elementals which constitute the universe, there is an elemental karma. And there is a law of elemental karma which is working out. Applied to psychology, it would be that in the journey of the universe, certain amount of all effects have to be worked through. And out of this whole, say for example, in the whole journey of the universe, say 10 kg of anger has to be worked through. Then maybe out of that 1 kg will come to the human species, and out of that 0.1 microgram to an individual. So the individual is not disjointed from the existence. There is one organic whole. And this is not Immanuel Kant's position of the subject and the object alienated from one another, except being connected by the process of observation or the process of engagement. This is more of a Hegelian position, where the subject and the object both are connected to an absolute, and both are working towards the purpose of the absolute in an organic whole system. So what happens in the human mind as an individual, how much of it is also related to the collectivity, the journey of the universe. And this collectivity can go from the family to society to humanity to universe. That connection of laws from the micro to the macro is a different take of the Upanishads compared to psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis, the individual is a disjointed entity. So it does not go into an individual related to the flow of the universe. It is recently that we have even talked about transpersonal in the context of the individual mind. And this transpersonal comes from, one is genetic experiments which tell us that a rat which was traumatized 2 generations down, the offspring still suffers from that traumatic experience, the effects of that traumatic experience, although the offspring has never seen the parent, which means the genetic transmission of trauma. Jung talked about it in a different way of collective unconscious, sort of a more ethereal psychic unison across the world of the human species. More esoteric than the genetic transpersonal. And then there is a parapsychological transpersonal. But much wider and much above all this is something the Upanishad talks about. The purpose of the universe, the karma of the elementals, the karma of the human being and the self journey of the human being, and how these factors become the founding laws from which these become like the primary laws from which the secondary laws flow or secondary events flow using laws existing otherwise. So if we analyze psychoanalytic phenomena in more elemental terms, only then we would come here. So first we will have to move from psychoanalysis to epistemology to an elemental analysis, and only at the level of elemental analysis can we synthesize or engage with a conversation with Upanishads on this point 5. Goal of life, psychoanalysis is agnostic. The person has to find his own goal of life, and there may not be any goal of life in reality apart from what we believe. For Upanishads, the goal of life is very clear. It is affirmative, very positive, that the goal of life is enlightenment, realization of Brahman. The healing process in psychoanalysis is what we know classically, therapy. If we broaden it to psychotherapy, we can include experiential, experimental healing. We can also include certain living in behavioral approach. But in Upanishads, flowing out of Upanishads, the process of healing and self-development is very different. Upanishads are not meant to heal psychotherapy, psychopathology, but what flows from that knowledge reservoir is this. When Upanishad talk about here and now, it is not the here and now between the teacher and the student. When it says here and now, it means having a state of no thought and focusing, being completely in the present. So Upanishads here and now is very different from psychoanalytic here and now. Upanishads use here and now for healing, enjoyment, and spiritual progress. The second spiritual technique in Upanishads is going into a state of no thought as far as possible. It's a goal state. Psychoanalysis does not even believe this is possible or this can be brought about and sustained for a long time. Upanishad uses the techniques of meditation, devotion, visualization, and most importantly, idol therapy. Idol therapy is a very deep science, very wide therapy. It is like an aggregating therapy which uses all other tools: meditation, devotion, visualization, mantra, music, art. So it's a therapy by itself. Much of the science is lost, but not difficult to rediscover. Those who are interested more in this can see some of my sessions before and some of my blogs. Psychoanalysis does not use much of holistic healing, but the Vedic Upanishadic way is not only open to but fundamental in not only using but even creating techniques of energy healing, now popular as Reiki, pranic healing, Tai Chi, other techniques also, especially crystal healing, and past life regression. So these are some of the techniques we don't use in psychoanalysis, but from a Upanishadic point of view, can be used, are used. See the differences here. We can consider these differences and where we feel a synthesis can be done, or we can test out the differences, and then where we feel convinced after testing, we can synthesize. I'm sure if we test out most of the things in Upanishad will pass the test, and we will be able to enrich psychoanalysis with those tested elements from the Upanishads. One very important element that flows from the Upanishad in fact, not one, but three. One, the structure of reality in Upanishad is very different. So the universe is thought of to be of 5 zones: the zone of matter, energy, and force, zone of life, zone of emotions, zone of thought, zone of karma, and the zone of pure consciousness. The human integer is constituted by taking a small part from each. The soul takes a small part from each to constitute the human integer. Psychoanalysis does not have this kind of a cosmology or ontology, doesn't go there, it leaves it to philosophy. So the first difference is of the structure of reality. Second, the structure of the human integer, because in Upanishadic light, the soul creates the human integer by taking a small part from each of these zones. And therefore, the human being also has those 5 bodies interpenetrating each other. The physical, the astral, the emotional, the intellectual, the karmic, and then soul behind it, rather in the center of it. The third difference, very important difference, is that of purpose. That the Upanishads are very clear about the purpose of life being enlightenment. Not so for psychoanalysis. And the fourth difference, very important, is what I have put on the screen. The difference on the concept of drives. In psychoanalysis, we see the pleasure drive, the drive for survival, the drive for pleasure. If you take in the death instinct, then the drive of aggression towards destruction and masochism. Here, in the light of Upanishad, we find something different. The drive for spiritual search is a very strong drive an autonomous drive and an innate drive. It is not something that you decide, it happens. It happens when the time comes. In Brahma Sutra, there is a very good statement, Athato Brahma Jigyasa, now that it has begun. What has begun? The desire for search of enlightenment. In the language of Brahma Sutra, Brahma. So the spiritual search is a part of the human apparatus, hardwired into us. Similarly, is a search for omnipotence, and this is something I think we can easily incorporate into psychoanalysis, because if we go deep enough into Kleinian psychoanalysis or deep enough into the subject of narcissism from any school we want, the desire for omnipotence is hardwired at the very fundamental depths of our being. And the light of Upanishad says this is because we come from an omnipotent position and we want to go back to the omnipotent position. So the drive for omnipotence, the drive for freedom, the search for freedom, not being content with banality of every day. Not being content with the secular, the rational, and not being a creature of balance. We want intensity. We want to overflow into an excess. So there is a desire for stability and ordinariness, and there is also a desire to flow into intensity and into an excess. So we want every day with a different weekend. The proportion of every day and weekend depends on the individual. But we need far more weekends than we really actually have, or we believe we want to have. We want far more than what we believe we want. We also are always drawn to the extraordinary. So these are the drives. The drive for spiritual search of enlightenment, drive for omnipotence, drive for freedom from compulsions, even of desire. Drive for freedom per se, even from attachments, even as we want attachments. Not being content with the banality of every day, not being content with the secular, the rational, not being a creature of balance, but wanting to overflow into an excess. The want for the extraordinary. Jung used to say, to be normal is the ideal aim of the unsuccessful. In fact, it cannot be the aim of anybody. Spirituality, philosophy, ideology can be the strongest of motivations, so strong that they may overpower and subordinate our ordinary motivations. We see this explicitly in crises, in wars. And human beings need war. Not because there is a need, but there is a need to discharge what is pent up. We also see this in spirituality, where people override their ordinary desires to progress on the spiritual path. They want their superego to control and completely crush the id. And there is a pleasure of the superego in doing so. Pleasure so high, it surpasses the pleasure of the id, or the turmoil and the trouble of the id. There is a drive to establish the rule of superego. Overcoming the rule of id as we find it. There is an intrinsic drive, innate drive in human species to establish the rule of superego inside and outside, and overthrow the reign of id inside and outside as we find it. And this is innately hardwired into the species. Not appreciated enough by psychoanalysis. The strength and the centrality of superego. Talk of superego pathology, we don't talk of superego strength, superego pleasure, superego joy, superego constructive contribution to our life. Superego health is a far wider area than superego pathology. And we see it every day. We all want superego to reign over it all the time. At least in others, if not in ourselves. And when this becomes too difficult, we want the kingdom of id for some time. So the ordinary situation of desire for the kingdom of id actually is not the only desire. There is also the desire for a rule of superego, which we underestimate. So there is, of course, a desire for the kingdom of id, and we being the emperor of that kingdom. But there is also a desire for the rule of the superego. And the Upanishad brings about this aspect which we can incorporate. If we look at the technique aspect or the goal aspect of therapy, what do we see? In psychoanalysis, we see based upon reflecting, not acting, insight for change, focused on thought, affect, and behavior, amoral and purpose agnostic. To summarize, on the other side, Upanishads, the goal is very clear, the spiritual goal of enlightenment. Upanishads are not purpose agnostic, they are very purpose positive, very committed and clear. The philosophy of Upanishad itself heals. This is a cognitive healing by believing in a philosophy. That itself is a healing process. Not that it would go deep enough and heal everything, but it does contribute to healing. There is an element that philosophical belief also contributes to one's psychological health. And the Upanishadic philosophy is one of that. It is not like an existential philosophy which will disturb you even more. But it is a philosophy that provides succor, it heals. Similarly, tools and techniques which flow out of Upanishadic light also heal and give relief. The goal of Upanishad does not end at normalcy like psychoanalysis. The goal is fundamental resolution of problems of pleasure and aggression forever. Approach is holistic to heal or healing. Living for healing is not prohibited, unlike in psychoanalysis. The healing methods which flow out of Upanishadic knowledge, they go into living. And the best example can be Tantra, where you go into living for healing, not stop at reflecting. Upanishads talk about rare experiences and rare attainments out of scope for psychoanalysis at present. I hope it comes into the scope, into the center of consideration for psychoanalysis. The goal states that Upanishads talk about, the states of enlightenment. Upanishads talk about the program of soul, soul journey, karma, grace, and guru. And all of these are very necessary for self-development, conceptually and in practice. So we see the differences and the synthesis can enrich both of them. And if we put all of it together, one can slowly move to a comprehensive theory of synthesis. Thank you. We have completed Yoga Sutras, Brahma Sutras, Upanishads. Subsequent sessions will take up Gita, possibly Hatha Yoga Pradapika and Japji. We are doing it quite fast. We are not taking it book by book, line by line commentary, detailed commentary on something. If you have any questions, write to me at hvindia@gmail.com. Thank you.